We
Yeah.
want to turn our attention here to the U.S. presidential election. Last stretch here, last few weeks, Kamala Harris has been floundering a little bit in the polls in different states and in different contexts. And there's a lot of conversation about the Democrats losing ground with key constituencies, particularly in the African American community, but also in the labor movement and other places. And obviously, the impact of the war on Gaza, the economy in general, on their appeal, and also the possibility of Trump winning. So, anyway, to get into as much of this as we can, we are very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show by Lawrence Grandpre, who is the director of research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, which is a grassroots think tank in Baltimore City, Maryland. Lawrence, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. And I guess the first question I want to ask you, I know you saw it, the New York Times, had a big article out earlier this week, or I think it was earlier this week, into last week, about the drop in support for Democrats among black voters. They noted that, based on the polling where we are since 2016, according to them, about a 22% drop in sort of net support for amongst black people for Democrats over Republicans. So pretty big drop. There's a number of other numbers in there. There's a whole broader conversation, but just sticking with that sort of general statistic, I wonder, what you think is behind that.
So, looking at some of the research from 2020, turnout in places like Philadelphia, Milwaukee was actually down in 2020 compared to 2016, despite a massive increase nationwide in turnout. And I attribute that to middle class, poor black folks, despite the rhetoric of black folks saving democracy, not being engaged with the Democratic Party platform. Joe Biden, of course, the architect of the crime bill. Now we have Kamala Harris, former prosecutor, and someone who, again, is not actually reflecting the needs of the black community in terms of investing in jobs that are worth doing, jobs that are unionized, economic and power redistribution. We're looking at a black community that feels taken for granted. And we're seeing softening not only in the black male vote, but also the black female percentage. Some of that might be religion stuff with the abortion debate, but I think it's also just there's a class dynamic within the black female woman community that working class and poor black women who are seeing the impacts of mass incarceration, like the platform that she put out really had nothing that was restorative of that harm except cannabis legalization, which the way that she would probably do it would not be restorative at all. So it really is people desperate to want to believe in this Democratic Party that our grandparents really brought us into with stories of the civil rights movement. But looking at the conditions of the community, I'm here in West Baltimore Park Heights, and abandoned homes, and the only solution we get is gentrification. And so if it's gentrification or nothing, and we are the party of gentrification, the Democratic Party tied to the universities, the hospitals that drive all the gentrification, and the nonprofit industrial complex. It feels so hard for working class black people to deeply connect to what the party is offering. And I think that's part of why you're seeing that softening of support.
Some could make the argument that this has been going on with the Democratic Party for a very long time. It has, right? Like their solutions all sound the same. They're empty slogans. They never follow through on them. In fact, sometimes they don't even give us slogans. In the case of Kamala Harris, I haven't heard her address the issue of incarceration at all or police brutality. I've only heard her say that she wants to increase the number of Border Patrol officers and deport more. If we're going to talk about anything when it comes to criminal justice system issues. Also, she has a very fraught history when it comes to that system in particular, being the top cop in California. But I'm just curious, why it's different this time around, right? Because it's the same sort of right-wing Democratic Party with the same corporate solutions that aren't actually solutions, that aren't really addressing the needs of working class people. So what's different this time around? Because if you read the media, I've even seen the argument be made by some liberals, which is, I got to even repeat it, like makes me cringe. But this is the argument you see, is that it's just that black men don't like a strong black woman. I don't know if you've seen that argument, but that's one that's being parroted on the interwebs, which, I obviously don't buy. But yeah, what's going on here this time around that's different from, for example, when Hillary Clinton was running? Or is this a part of an ongoing trend about the Democratic Party?
So I've seen that talking point as well. Of course, it was presented by Barack Obama, saying when he spoke to, quote, the brothers, that we need to not be afraid of a strong sister. The reality is, it's almost the exact same polling we saw with Biden and Trump. I remember that being a freak out in 2020, about 20% of black men potentially voting for Trump. The reality was, about 11%, which is about the standard. I think there is a lot of concern about the rise of the black manosphere. The joke was the CIA dropped off podcast equipment in the hood to destroy black communities. And there was just all this rise of podcasting and YouTubing during the pandemic. So now we're seeing more exposure to black men who are articulating perspectives that many women not only find wrong, but perplexing. And I do think there is a degree of gender disintegration economically, where black women have been more integrated into some components of the nonprofit industrial complex, some components of, especially here in Baltimore, government jobs, federal jobs, in a way that black men haven't, with the loss of construction work, large scale public projects. So even with the transportation bill, that transportation bill was, a couple billion, or a couple trillion. They were talking about a $10 trillion infrastructure bill 10 years ago. So the ability for black men to find space in the economy can lead to some resentment. A lot of those folks don't vote, and they didn't vote before. So we're seeing a disconnect between what looks like a rise in black male resentment and conservatism. When reality is that just has not been borne out electorally, because a lot of those folks don't vote and never do vote. Some of them vote independent, some of them vote libertarian, and there's just so many black men who just vote Democrat because that's what their aunts tell them to do. That's what their cousins tell them to do, but they don't got no podcasts. So we have a disconnect between that reality. But again, it begs the question of, do they deserve to vote? There was no connection at all in that agenda between domestic black issues and foreign policy. No understanding that black folks of all genders could be saying, look what's happening in Lebanon, look what's happening in Gaza. I can't put my name on that. I can't put my credibility on that. And the fact that they were not connected to, I think, is demonstrative of their inability to take black people as a people with moral consciousness seriously.
I think that's an amazing point. In fact, that was one of the things that stood out to most of me in the New York Times poll is, it was a majority of black voters overall, but under 30 of the respondents, 71% said that they agreed with the phrase, we should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems here at home. But of course, it's always stated that anything overseas is like a non-black issue, and that, has its own its own history to it as well. And I guess it just speaks to maybe a broader point that I think you're making here, but I'd like to hear you expand on, is also like sort of the caricature of black voters, men and women. Like we've had this, sort of media, political complex sort of define what black issues are, develop the Charlemagne the gods of the world to be the interlocutors we're all supposed to believe are the, this is the gateway to what black people really want. And it just seems like the deeper you dig into, not only our own anecdotal experiences as being black all our lives, but the actual facts and statistics, that a lot of that picture is not really the pulse of the community.
I couldn't agree more. I believe that it's amazing that one of the main issues they trot out is voting rights. So the only reason you vote is to protect your right to vote. It's a massive circular argument that only feeds the Democratic Party. We're a captured electorate. They depend so desperately on black turnout, and they get these 90%, 90-10 splits with black voters they don't get anywhere else, and they feel entitled to them. And any possibility of losing that, it's like, how dare you betray me? When in reality, again, thinking the complexity and the heterogeneity of the black population, we're increasingly becoming secular. So the caricature of the black souls to the polls, the black chat's complex. And with that black church vote, it's becoming more evangelical than traditional Baptist. So some of those folks may have issues with some of the reproductive justice stuff. And that's black women, right? But that challenges our caricatures of black women as what we're being presented as the Kamala Harris, the black Greek sorority, yes, queen, souls to the polls type folks. Those people exist, but they're also just massive swaths of black folks, especially black men who are maybe formerly incarcerated, addicted, or disconnected from the traditional economy. Not only do they not turn out, Becky Pettit's book, Invisible Men, talks about the way we do our surveying actually massively overcounts the percentage of poor working class black men who do turn out. So black men turnout, when you actually look at it, can be as low as 20, 35%, when we're calling it 50%. There's so many people who I see that as them actively voting. No, I will not put my name into this system. I am voting no, that I reject the legitimacy of this system. That is a political act that's being read as political apathy.
I am curious because there's also this narrative that Black people are increasingly supporting Trump. And I don't know if there's any truth to that. I don't know if there's just because you're not enthusiastic anymore as much about the Democratic Party doesn't necessarily mean you're voting for Republican. So I guess my question here is two-pronged. Is there growing support for the Republican Party and Donald Trump inside the Black community, which is what I think someone like, for example, Candace Owens is kind of, ambitiously pushing for with her platforms? And also, is there growing support in certain sectors of the Black community for the idea of third-party voting?
So I would say only at the margins. The vast majority of Black folks, whether we like it or not, are loyal Democrats. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I actually was on the college debate team with Nate Cohen, who does the polling at New York Times. So just in college, I just had a large engagement with polling through knowing him. And the polling is pretty consistent. There is some young Black progressive engagement with the Green Party and the Socialist Party that is real, but maybe more at the margins in big cities. Many of those are in blue states. And I will say there is a hustle grind set culture, especially amongst younger Black men, that has been more traditionally affiliated with the Republican Party. Now, whether that crosses over to Trump, I don't know. And I don't think it is this massive influence. What we know is, and this is what's happening, these are media people who are terrified that there are Black folks on YouTube that can get hundreds of thousands of millions of views that are not gatekept by them. So they're terrified by that. My experience is that typically actually doesn't have a lot of influence on voting because, unfortunately, again, a lot of those folks don't vote. And when you age into voting in the Black community, you age into voting through Democratic Party channels, through my kids are going to school, what's wrong with the schools? Who's helping the schools get money? The Democrats, right? So I would say that, again, the cultural impact of these Black manosphere conversations is deeply frightening to the political establishment, but in a way that doesn't reflect political shifts on the ground in aggregate.
I think that's an extraordinarily important point on a number of different elements. I want to turn to kind of a narrow question here before we let you go. But you referenced it a little bit earlier in terms of how she's approaching the issue of the criminal legal system. And, I just pulled up her, program for Black men. There's just a few things that strike me about law enforcement. I mean, one, saying that she says she wants to actually provide more money for the police to hire more cops, from the communities they serve. But look, you're in Baltimore. I lived in Baltimore. I lived in D.C. It's like a lot of the cops are already Black, and here we are. But then the other thing that really caught me is that invest in proven community violence intervention programs. But then when you read the actual fine print, it talks about community-based organizations working with law enforcement to reduce violence and crime. But a lot of the best violence interruption programs actually explicitly don't work with law enforcement to be able to build trust with those in the community. And it just seems like so much of this approach is so rooted in maintaining the legitimacy of the institution of the police at all cost, but just putting a little black gloss on it. I mean, it seems completely ridiculous in that it couldn't really speak to anyone who's on the bad end of the baton.
Yes. It is a deeply captured, almost perverse relationship where the suffering of our people, the street violence we've been dealing with for decades, is a cudgel used to force us into the co-option of that industry. So some of the folks doing that work are folks from Nation of Islam, folks who are formerly street affiliated, aka gang affiliated, who are adamant about not having that tied to police. But not only does Kamala talk about forcing them to engage the police, up to 60% of the money from the grants given to community violence intervention programs can be siphoned off by the administrators and the evaluators and the technical assistance providers. So that's Johns Hopkins. That's nonprofit industrial complex. And I argue that's also, unfortunately, increasingly the Democratic Party's base of suburban college-educated folks. So in her very agenda that claims to be the thing that is most giving money to what many people in community see as a critical issue of community violence, gun violence, that's also a setup for that industry to be co-opted by the nonprofit industrial complex, which is a jobs program for the new suburban college educated Democratic base. We've talked about that quite a bit here at LBS, about how this is a prime example of when you are a captured electorate. Even when they claim to adjust your needs, they're doing it in a way that has that interest convergence, as Derek Bell said, to feed their interest. We don't accept that. We build autonomously. We demand forms of local and state funding to actually keep those services community accountable. And we're going to do that in a Trump world or a Kamala world. And sadly, in a Trump world, people are going to, they can't depend on the feds anymore because the money will get cut off. And people will actually realize, oh, we have to do local control, state and local funding of these services, not beg the feds for money because the gravy train is going to crash. So it's complicated. We're going to organize no matter what. But I think that is a good example of critical issues being co-opted by the Democratic Party.
Well, as always, Lawrence Grandpre, Director of Research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. It's an honor to have you here. Appreciate you giving us some of your time on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.